In the winter of 1949, inside a sprawling 40-acre factory complex on the edge of Newark Bay in Bayonne, New Jersey, the power tools went quiet. The massive Elco Naval Division shipyard had survived the frantic pace of the Second World War. It had launched a heavily armed warship into American waters every 60 hours. It had employed over 3,000 American men and women. But now, in the middle of a post-war economic boom, the civilian yacht division was abruptly dismantled. Half-finished mahogany cruisers were halted on the production floor. Master shipwrights, men who knew the grain of double-planked cedar by touch, were handed their final paychecks. The sweeping assembly lines that had defined American recreational boating for 5 decades simply stopped moving. The doors were locked. The bay water lapped against empty bulkheads. Just 4 years earlier, this same brand was an untouchable American icon. The name on the builder's plate was a guarantee of survival in the Pacific Theater, where their legendary PT boats had carried American sailors, including a future president, through hostile waters. A decade before that, they had been the undisputed masters of the American Marina, the company that had turned yachting from a millionaire's privilege into a standardized, middle-class reality. They possessed the engineering, the national reputation, and the absolute trust of the American watermen. But the true story of the electric launch company in America is not just the story of a famous shipyard closing its doors. It is the story of a tragic intersection. It is the story of what happens when a legacy of quiet, varnished wooden craftsmanship collides with the brutal, scaled-up economics of the Cold War military-industrial complex and the relentless advance of the modern marine market. Every week, we tell the stories of the vessels that defined American maritime supremacy and the brutal economic forces that ultimately dismantled them. Like the video and subscribe if that history matters to you. Music. But to understand how this legendary shipyard fell silent in 1949, the story must begin not with wartime steel, but with absolute quiet in Chicago in 1893. To understand what the electric launch company built, you must first understand what the American water sounded like in 1892. It was deafening, it was industrial, it was dangerous. Before the end of the 19th century, an American seeking to move across water had only a few options, and none of them were designed for casual leisure. The commercial ports of New York, Boston, and Chicago were dominated by steam power. Steam required immense boilers, tons of heavy coal, and a constant aggressive fire. A steam vessel demanded a licensed engineer just to keep the boiler from exploding, and it coated its passengers in a fine layer of black soot. For smaller pleasure craft, the alternatives were equally hostile. The naphtha launch, a small boat powered by boiling a highly volatile petroleum fluid to spin an engine, was popular but inherently terrifying. It possessed a tendency to catch fire. Sailboats, meanwhile, demanded specific physical skills, local wind knowledge, and a willingness to be stranded when the weather died. The American watermen lacked a reliable, clean, and simple bridge between the massive steam yacht and the manual rowboat. The market demanded a vessel that could simply be turned on. The answer did not begin in a traditional boatyard. It began with the Electric Storage Battery Company, a firm looking for a way to prove the viability of heavy electrical storage. In 1892, they formed the Electric Launch and Navigation Company, quickly shortened to Elco. Their objective was not initially to dominate American boating. It was to build a floating delivery system for their power cells. The engineering concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of a volatile boiler or a loud combustion engine, Elco used direct current electric motors. To power them, they relied on massive banks of lead-acid batteries. Lead-acid battery, a rechargeable power storage unit using heavy lead plates suspended in sulfuric acid, capable of delivering steady electrical current over several hours. In a land vehicle, the immense weight of these early batteries was a crippling flaw. On the water, it was a structural advantage. Elco's engineers placed the battery banks entirely below the floorboards of their wooden launches. This placement acted as perfect ballast. Ballast, heavy material placed low in a vessel's hull to improve stability, lower the center of gravity, and prevent capsizing in rough water. With the weight concentrated deep in the hull, the boats were incredibly stable. Because there was no boiler and no drive machinery taking up the center of the vessel, the entire deck could be open for passengers. The controls were reduced to a simple steering wheel and a lever for forward and reverse. There was no noise, no smoke, no vibration, and no engineer required. But a new technology in the maritime world means nothing without a public demonstration. Elco did not slowly build a dealer network. They orchestrated the most spectacular product launch in American maritime history. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition. The fairgrounds were built around a sprawling network of artificial lagoons and canals, designed to showcase the future of American industry. The organizers needed a way to transport millions of visitors across the water safely and quietly. Steam was too dirty. Naphtha was too dangerous. They awarded the passenger contract to the newly formed Elco. The company delivered a fleet of exactly 55 electric launches. They were 36 feet long, finished in gleaming mahogany, and completely silent. For 6 months from May to October 1893, these 55 hulls glided continuously through the Chicago lagoons. They operated reliably, day after day, in front of the entire nation. By the time the fair closed, the Elco fleet had carried exactly 1,026,346 passengers. For the vast majority of those Americans, it was their first time on a pleasure boat. It was their first experience with electric power. The silence of the hull moving through the water felt like magic. When the exposition ended, Elco possessed 55 proven boats and a massive national profile. They sold the used Chicago fleet to private buyers, immediately seeding the American market. The company relocated its manufacturing base to Bayonne, New Jersey, establishing a shipyard on the edge of Newark Bay with direct access to the wealth of New York City. The early adoption was swift, but restricted by infrastructure. At a price of roughly $1,500 in 1894, the equivalent of $53,000 today, an Elco launch was an expensive luxury. More importantly, it required an electrical grid to charge. In the 1890s, the American electrical grid was virtually non-existent outside of major urban centers. Therefore, the first American buyers were not average families. They were the ultra-wealthy elites of Newport, Rhode Island, and the owners of sprawling private camps in the Adirondacks. In these exclusive enclaves, owners built private charging docks. Men like Thomas Edison and John Jacob Astor purchased Elco electric boats for their summer estates. The vessels became the ultimate status symbol of the Gilded Age. Early maritime publications like Forest and Stream praised the boats for their flawless silence, noting that they allowed wealthy sportsmen to glide up to waterfowl without making a sound. By 1900, Elco had established the brand. They had the factory in Bayonne. They had the attention of the American elite. But Isaac Rice and the management at Elco recognized a fatal ceiling in their business model. A shipyard cannot survive on selling custom electric boats to millionaires with private generators. To build a true maritime empire, they needed a vessel that could leave the charging dock behind. They needed a boat that ran on liquid fuel, and they needed to build it on an assembly line. In 1914, the management at the Bayonne shipyard made a decision that fundamentally rewired the American recreational water market. Electric launches were beautiful, silent, and refined, but they were tethered to the shore by their charging cables. To build a true maritime empire, Elco needed to cut the cord. They needed a vessel that ran on liquid fuel, and they needed to build it with the brutal efficiency of an automotive plant. Elco did not just adopt the gasoline engine. They adopted Henry Ford. That year, they introduced a vessel called the Cruisette. The original model was a 32-foot wooden cabin cruiser. Cabin cruiser, a powerboat equipped with a hardtop superstructure, a sleeping berth, a small galley, and marine plumbing, designed to allow a family to live aboard for a weekend or longer without relying on shore facilities. Stepping aboard an early Elco Cruisette was a revelation in spatial efficiency and maritime packaging. The hull was constructed of clear white cedar planks, securely fastened over heavy, steam-bent oak frames. The decks were solid planked and caulked to withstand the relentless assault of summer rain and salt spray. The cabin was finished in rich, varnished mahogany, gleaming with heavy cast bronze hardware. It featured a steering station that was open to the summer air, but protected from the midday sun by a canvas awning. Below deck, it offered 2 wide sleeping berths, an insulated icebox, a small alcohol stove, and a functioning toilet. It was not a fragile toy for a protected lagoon. It was a highly capable seaworthy machine built to handle the coastal chop of the Atlantic. At its introduction, a standard Elco cruisette was priced at roughly $2,450, approximately $44,000 in today's money. In an era where a custom-built private yacht required an initial commission of $10,000, an on-staff naval architect, a private boatyard, and a full-time paid crew, the cruisette price tag was an industry earthquake. A doctor, a mid-level bank manager, or an auto executive could buy the boat, captain it himself, and maintain it with weekend labor. The market was no longer defined by inherited wealth. It was defined by the rising American middle class. To achieve this price point without sacrificing seaworthiness, Elco revolutionized the American boatyard. Before 1914, almost every recreational boat in America was built one at a time. Carpenters measured, cut, and fit each individual piece of wood on the shop floor. Elco introduced standardized production to the marine sector. Standardized production, an industrial manufacturing method where hull frames, deck planks, engine mounts, and interior cabinets are pre-cut to exact identical templates before they ever reach the assembly floor, allowing workers to assemble identical vessels rapidly. Inside the sprawling Bayonne facility, the smell of fresh cedar mixed with the relentless, driving rhythm of industrial machinery. Dozens of keels were laid out simultaneously on the factory floor. Keel, the central structural backbone along the bottom of a vessel that helps provide strength and stability. If an Elco owner in Michigan hit a submerged log and damaged his rudder, he did not need to hire a master carpenter to carve a new one from scratch. He simply telegraphed the Bayonne factory, and they shipped an exact, pre-cut replacement part by rail the very next day. This was not just a manufacturing triumph. It was a logistical moat that smaller, regional boat builders simply could not cross. The owner, the mechanic, and the marina all depended on the same standardized parts shelf. The distribution model was equally unprecedented. Elco realized that forcing buyers to travel to a dusty, noisy industrial shipyard in New Jersey to order a boat was a barrier to sales, so they brought the shipyard directly to the consumer. By the 1920s, they opened Port Elco, a massive, opulent showroom located entirely indoors on Park Avenue in Manhattan, right next to Grand Central Terminal. New York executives could walk out of their offices on a Tuesday, step into Port Elco, examine a fully rigged 34-foot cruisette sitting dry on a showroom floor, write a check, and have the vessel delivered to the water by Friday afternoon. The cruisette rapidly colonized the American waterways. It became an essential, dominant fixture at the annual New York Motorboat Show. Fleets of standard cruisettes began filling the moorings at the Manhasset Bay Yacht Club on Long Island Sound. They appeared on the docks of the Detroit Yacht Club, where automotive fortunes sought an escape onto the fresh water of the Great Lakes. They navigated the shallow, challenging currents of the Chesapeake Bay, and they became the favored winter cruisers for northern owners shipping their boats down to Biscayne Bay in Miami. The transition to internal combustion engines provided the vast range that electric batteries lacked. Internal combustion engine, a motor that generates power by burning fuel, such as gasoline or diesel, directly inside its cylinders to drive a piston and turn a propeller shaft. While early electric launches were confined to the harbor, a gasoline-powered cruisette could travel hundreds of miles. Early models utilized a highly efficient semi-displacement hull. Semi-displacement hull, a hull formed between displacement and planing designs, offering moderate speed with better fuel efficiency and superior stability in rough water than a pure planing hull. With a reliable marine engine turning the propeller, a cruisette could comfortably cruise at 10 to 12 miles per hour all day long. It was not built for offshore racing. It was built for endurance, comfort, and absolute predictability. By the late 1920s, Elco was manufacturing the cruisette in multiple lengths, 26 feet, 34 feet, and beyond. They were producing hundreds of identical vessels every single year. They were defining the shape of the American weekend. They were dominating the coastal waters. The name on the builder's plate was not a country of origin. It was a specification. By the middle of the 1920s, the Electric Launch Company was no longer just a boat builder. It was a primary architect of American coastal leisure. The Bayonne factory was consuming raw timber by the trainload, turning out cruisettes, vedettes, and motor yachts in lengths from 26 to 58 feet. But a vessel is only a product until the geography accepts it. Elco became an empire because the American coastline adopted it as standard equipment. The adoption was systematic and geographically vast. The Manhasset Bay Yacht Club in New York wanted the weekend escape. The Thousand Islands on the St. Lawrence River wanted reliable family transport across deep, unforgiving fresh water. The affluent winter enclaves of Biscayne Bay and Miami wanted a vessel that could navigate the shallow sandbars of Florida while maintaining absolute social prestige. The Marine Service yards of Fort Lauderdale wanted predictability. The mechanics in Annapolis wanted engines they could actually reach and repair. Elco delivered a hull for all of them. By 1926, industry records suggest the company was delivering hundreds of standardized cruisers annually, accounting for a massive share of the American middle to upper class recreational market. They maintained authorized dealer presences and service relationships, stretching from the rocky, fog-bound harbors of Maine, through the crowded slips of the Chesapeake Bay, all the way down to the sun-bleached docks of the Florida Keys. The name Elco appeared constantly in the pages of motorboating and yachting magazines. The boats were not simply popular. They were the baseline against which every other American boat builder, companies like Chris-Craft, Richardson, and Matthews, had to measure their own production lines. But the ultimate validation of an American maritime brand does not come from a yacht club veranda. It comes from the men who have to run the boat in the dark, in the cold, and under the threat of violence. In 1920, the United States enacted the Volstead Act, prohibiting the sale of alcohol and immediately creating a massive, illegal, and highly lucrative maritime smuggling industry. This was the era of the rum runner. Smugglers needed boats that could meet offshore supply ships beyond the 3-mile territorial limit, load heavy crates of illicit liquor, and run back to the American coast in the dead of night, often in terrible weather. They did not want experimental racing hulls. They wanted absolute mechanical reliability. They bought Elcos. The rum runners quickly discovered that a 34-foot Elco cruisette, stripped of its fine upholstery and loaded with extra fuel tanks, was the perfect smuggling machine. The hull possessed a generous beam. Beam, the width of a vessel at its widest point, which determines its stability and how much weight it can safely carry. Because of this wide beam, an Elco could swallow tons of cargo without dangerously compromising its freeboard. Freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck edge, vital for keeping waves out of the boat when heavily loaded and maintaining reserve buoyancy. The boats were quiet, painted in dark colors to blend into the Atlantic swells, and their internal combustion engines were famously dependable. The U.S. Coast Guard, tasked with stopping this massive influx of contraband, realized they were entirely outmatched by the civilian fleet. The government's large, heavy cutters were too slow to catch the smugglers, and their small harbor boats were useless in the open ocean. So the Coast Guard did the only logical thing. They went to the Bayonne shipyard and ordered Elco boats. For a decade, the waters off Long Island, New Jersey, and Massachusetts became a chaotic, high-stakes proving ground. Elco cruisers, operated by federal agents, hunted Elco cruisers operated by smugglers. They pushed the wooden frames and the gasoline engines to their absolute breaking points, operating in winter storms that civilian boaters never saw. On a freezing, pitch-black Atlantic midnight off Montauk, where a lighter, flatter hull would slam uncontrollably and shatter its frames under the weight of a heavy cargo, the sturdy, semi-displacement Elco hull could hold its course, absorb the impact of the swells, and bring its crew back to the inlet alive. This brutal, unintended testing cemented the brand's reputation. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the legend of the Elco hull was completely bulletproof. A man buying a cruisette in 1935 knew he was buying a machine that had survived the most demanding unwritten trials in American waters. Throughout the Great Depression, while smaller boatyards went bankrupt by the dozens, Elco survived. They refined their aesthetic, introducing streamlined cabin profiles and stronger, more efficient marine engines. By the close of the 1930s, walking down a dock in Newport or Miami and stepping onto an Elco meant stepping onto the undisputed pinnacle of American wooden boat building. The varnish caught the afternoon sun perfectly. The exhaust hummed with steady, rhythmic confidence. The cabin smelled of rich cedar, salt air, and expensive rope. But the company's greatest and ultimately fatal American triumph was still ahead of them, waiting in the gathering storm of the Second World War. In 1939, as the Second World War erupted in Europe, the United States Navy recognized a glaring vulnerability in its fleet architecture. The Navy possessed massive steel battleships and heavy cruisers built in deep water yards, but it severely lacked a highly maneuverable, fast attack craft capable of operating in shallow coastal waters. They needed a torpedo boat. The management at Elco recognized that the survival of the company depended on securing government defense contracts. They did not attempt to invent a new hull form from scratch. Instead, they purchased a 70-foot prototype from the British designer Hubert Scott Payne. But American naval doctrine demanded a vessel that could carry more fuel, heavier armament, and sustain longer patrols in the punishing swells of the open ocean. The engineers at the Bayonne shipyard took the British concept and scaled it up to American proportions. They extended the length to 80 feet. They heavily reinforced the hull using a double-planked mahogany construction over thick white oak frames, sealing the layers with an aviation-grade canvas and marine glue to prevent leaks at high speeds. To push this massive wooden structure through the water, they abandoned standard marine engines and installed three massive, supercharged Packard V-12s. Marine aviation engine, a high-performance internal combustion engine originally designed for aircraft, modified to operate safely in a marine environment, delivering explosive horsepower to push a heavy hull onto a plane. The resulting vessel was the Elco PT boat, Patrol Torpedo. It was essentially a heavily armed 80-foot wooden racing runabout. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the government immediately turned to the only boat builder in America capable of manufacturing highly complex wooden cruisers on a standardized rapid assembly line. The Bayonne facility was completely transformed. It was reorganized as the Elco Naval Division. The opulent Port Elco showroom in Manhattan was closed. The New Jersey factory floor was aggressively expanded until it covered 40 waterfront acres. The workforce swelled to over 3,000 men and women, operating in relentless, round-the-clock shifts. The assembly line that had once produced weekend cruisers for doctors and bank managers now operated with a staggering, almost terrifying industrial velocity. At the absolute peak of wartime production, the Bayonne shipyard completed and launched a fully armed 80-foot warship in a Newark Bay every 60 hours. These vessels were immediately shipped to the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and, most famously, the Pacific Theater. In the Pacific, the Elco hull became legendary. In the narrow, reef-choked waters of the Solomon Islands at midnight, where a heavy steel destroyer would run aground or instantly trigger enemy radar, the shallow draft wooden Elco hull could idle silently in the dark, unleash a devastating torpedo strike against Japanese transport convoys, and immediately push its throttles forward to 40 knots, turning raw horsepower and planing dynamics into survival. Out of the sprawling American war machine, Elco produced exactly 399 PT boats, more than any other domestic builder, including their fierce rival Higgins Industries in New Orleans. The brand was etched into the national consciousness. One of those Bayonne-built hulls, PT-109, was commanded by a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy. When that specific boat was rammed and cut in half by a Japanese destroyer in the Blackett Strait, it was the sheer buoyancy and structural integrity of Elco's wooden hull construction that kept the wreckage afloat long enough for the surviving crew to cling to it before swimming to a nearby island. By the summer of 1945, the Elco shipyard at Bayonne was a deafening, perfectly synchronized engine of American industrial might. The scent of recreational varnish had been entirely replaced by the sharp odors of welding flux, high-octane aviation fuel, and freshly milled mahogany. Hundreds of identical, lethal hulls sat on the massive factory floor, surrounded by thousands of American workers who had mastered the logistics of turning raw timber into national defense. The Electric Launch Company possessed the largest wooden boat production facility on the planet. They possessed an endless supply of government capital. They possessed an engineering staff tested by global conflict and a brand name that commanded absolute, unquestioned respect from the Pacific Ocean to the Potomac River. As the war came to a close, it seemed impossible that such a sprawling maritime empire could ever fall silent. In August 1945, the Second World War ended, and the sprawling Elco Naval Division shipyard in Bayonne, New Jersey, faced an immediate structural crisis. The United States Navy abruptly canceled all remaining contracts for PT boats. The deafening round-the-clock assembly lines that had defined the factory for 4 years suddenly had no enemy to build against. Management possessed 40 acres of prime waterfront real estate, thousands of highly trained shipwrights, massive stockpiles of marine-grade mahogany, and a brand name forged in combat. The logical decision was to return to the market they had invented. Elco immediately pivoted back to the civilian recreational boater. In 1946, they launched an entirely new line of pleasure cruisers. The company leveraged their wartime reputation heavily, advertising the new fleet as PT proven. The designs clearly inherited the aggressive, fast-planing DNA of the torpedo boats. Planing hull, a hull designed to rise up and skim across the surface of the water at high speed, significantly reducing hydrodynamic drag compared to a traditional displacement vessel. The post-war fleet included models ranging from a sleek 27-foot sport cruiser to a massive, luxurious 62-foot motor yacht. They featured double-planked mahogany bottoms, streamlined superstructures, and powerful marine engines. At a price of roughly $7,000 for a smaller cruiser in 1946, approximately $115,000 today, Elco was targeting the booming post-war American middle and upper classes. Initially, the return appeared triumphant. The new models drew massive crowds at the National Motorboat Show in New York. Wealthy buyers in Miami, seasoned yachtsmen in Newport, and lakefront executives in Chicago placed orders. The boats were undeniably beautiful. They were fast. They were built with the uncompromising structural integrity of a warship. But beneath the gleaming varnish and the triumphant marketing, the tectonic plates of the American recreational maritime market were violently shifting. The decline of Elco was not triggered by a failure in their engineering. It was triggered by the arrival of two relentless, overlapping American market forces that no amount of mahogany could stop. The first was Force 5, maintenance, fuel, marina, crew, and infrastructure costs. Before the war, the American middle-class weekend was relatively uncrowded, and coastal labor was cheap. A bank manager who purchased a 30-foot Elco in 1935 could easily afford to pay a local New Jersey boatyard to maintain the vessel during the winter layup. Maintaining a traditional wooden boat is not a passive ownership experience. It is a continuous, labor-intensive battle against the elements. Every wooden hull requires extensive seasonal caulking. Caulking, the grueling process of driving cotton wicking and specialized marine sealing compound into the seams between wooden hull planks to make the vessel watertight. The decks and cabins required constant varnishing. Varnish breaks down rapidly under the relentless assault of ultraviolet sunlight and crystallized salt spray. If the varnish fails, the wood rots. Keeping an Elco looking like an Elco required hundreds of hours of sanding, scraping, and recoating every single year. After 1945, the American economic landscape transformed. The post-war industrial boom and the GI Bill created an incredibly strong job market. Blue-collar wages surged. The highly skilled shipwrights and boatyard mechanics who survived the war were no longer willing to work for pennies sanding hulls in freezing coastal boatyards. Consequently, the cost of professional marina maintenance skyrocketed. Simultaneously, the American weekend became fiercely competitive. The newly constructed interstate highway system, the explosion of suburban housing, and the mass production of the automobile offered families alternative ways to spend their leisure time. A post-war buyer wanted convenience. They wanted a product that served them, rather than a vessel that demanded their constant labor. The wooden Elco, for all its beauty and historical pedigree, was rapidly becoming a financial and temporal burden. This shifting consumer patience paved the way for the second, far more lethal threat. It was Force 4, technological disruption. During the war, military contractors and chemical companies had aggressively accelerated the development of synthetic composites. They needed materials for aircraft radar domes and lightweight armor that were immune to moisture and rot. The result of this research quietly entered the civilian boating market in the late 1940s. It was fiberglass. Fiberglass, a composite material made from woven threads of spun glass saturated in a liquid synthetic resin, which cures into a solid, rigid, and completely waterproof shell. To a master shipwright at the Bayonne shipyard, fiberglass was an industrial insult. It possessed no grain. It required no craftsmanship. It was poured into a female mold by unskilled labor and popped out as a finished hull. But to the American consumer and to the marina service networks across the country, fiberglass was a miracle. A fiberglass hull has no seams. Therefore, it requires no caulking. It does not swell when placed in the water, and it does not shrink when hauled out into the dry winter air. It does not suffer from dry rot. It is immune to marine borers. If a fiberglass boat is left uncovered in the blistering sun of a Florida marina for 6 months, the owner does not return to a ruined investment. They return, wash the hull with basic soap, and turn the key. Elco management clearly saw the synthetic revolution appearing on the horizon, but they were trapped by their own immense scale and identity. The 40-acre Bayonne plant was a cathedral built entirely for timber. Their specialized tooling, their supply chains deep into the cedar and mahogany forests, and their thousands of veteran employees were all optimized for wood. To pivot to fiberglass would mean abandoning their entire manufacturing philosophy, discarding millions of dollars in infrastructure, and firing the finest carpenters on the East Coast. So Elco chose to hold the line. They doubled down on tradition. They continued to market the superior ride, the quiet acoustics, and the unmatched prestige of a handcrafted wooden yacht. And for a brief moment, the American elite agreed with them. In yacht clubs from Long Island Sound to Puget Sound, a molded plastic boat was still viewed as a cheap toy, while an Elco remained a serious vessel for a serious mariner. But the domestic market was merciless. Competitors who had no legacy to protect began experimenting heavily with synthetics and molded plywood. As the 1940s drew to a close, the margins on civilian boat building at Bayonne began to thin. The boats were taking too long to build, the materials were becoming too expensive, and the American buyer was beginning to ask why they should pay a premium for a hull that required a second job to maintain. Yet the final blow to Elco's recreational empire would not be delivered by a competitor's fiberglass hull. It would be delivered from inside their own corporate boardroom, driven by a new kind of war that required a terrifying new kind of vessel. The Electric Launch Company was never entirely the master of its own destiny. Since 1899, it had operated as a subsidiary of a much larger, increasingly powerful conglomerate known as the Electric Boat Company. And while Elco had spent the war building wooden PT boats in New Jersey, its parent company had spent the war building massive steel fleet submarines in Groton, Connecticut. When the post-war economy settled, the corporate boardroom in New York looked at the two divisions and made a brutal, irreversible calculation about the future of American manufacturing. This was the final, devastating blow. It was a combination of Force One, domestic fleet dominance, and a massive shift in naval procurement priorities. As the 1940s ended, the United States was entering the Cold War. The American military doctrine was shifting toward the atomic age. The Pentagon did not need 80-foot wooden torpedo boats to counter the Soviet Union. They needed advanced, deep-water fleet submarines, and they were preparing to invest billions of dollars to get them. For the executives at Electric Boat, the mathematics of the American maritime market were undeniable. Securing a single, heavily classified submarine contract from the Department of Defense guaranteed millions of dollars in steady government-backed revenue. It required immense engineering resources, massive waterfront acreage, and absolute corporate focus. By contrast, the civilian Elco division was struggling to sell 70-foot wooden yachts to private buyers in a market that was becoming obsessed with cheap, maintenance-free fiberglass. Corporate consolidation, the strategic process where a parent company systematically eliminates a culturally significant but low-margin division to focus all available capital and waterfront infrastructure on its most profitable industrial sector, took hold. Selling a $7,000 mahogany cruiser to a dentist in New Jersey was no longer a viable business model for a company preparing to build the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. The Elco Yacht Division, with its massive Bayonne footprint, its complex civilian dealer network, and its hundreds of highly paid, specialized carpenters, was deemed a financial distraction. Electric Boat did not attempt to modernize the brand. They did not attempt to transition the Bayonne workforce into fiberglass production. They did not sell the legendary name to a competing boatyard. They simply executed the division. In early 1949, management ordered the complete and immediate shutdown of the Elco pleasure boat operation. The competitive displacement in the American market was rapid and merciless. The American marina did not mourn the loss of the cruisette for long. The slips that Elco vacated in Miami, Chicago, and Newport were immediately filled. For a few more years, domestic giants like Chris Craft absorbed the remaining wealthy traditionalists who still demanded varnished mahogany. But soon after, aggressive new companies leveraging the synthetic revolution, brands like Sea Ray and Hatteras, would arrive to completely dominate the coastal waterways, offering the exact affordable hose-and-go ownership experience that post-war Americans demanded. The Electric Boat Company would go on to form General Dynamics in 1952, becoming one of the most powerful defense contractors on the planet. They would build the USS Nautilus. They would build the backbone of the American nuclear deterrent. But to achieve that scale, they had to sacrifice the brand that had taught America how to spend a weekend on the water. The end of Elco was not a slow fade. It was an industrial execution. The 40-acre yard went quiet. The assembly line stopped moving. The master carpenters packed their tools. The massive timber sheds were emptied. The half-finished hulls were scrapped. The New York showroom was gone. The dealer contracts were voided. The parts network collapsed. The Bayonne gates locked. The name disappeared from the water. The immediate aftermath of the 1949 Bayonne shipyard closure was not a sudden disappearance of the vessels themselves. You cannot instantly erase tens of thousands of heavy wooden cruisers from the American coastline. For the next 2 decades, the Elco fleets continued to operate throughout Long Island Sound, the Great Lakes, and the Florida coast. But without a parent factory to supply pre-cut cedar planks, standardized bronze fittings, or specialized engine parts, the boats slowly became orphaned machinery. As the original owners aged and the cost of professional marina maintenance accelerated, many of the iconic cruisettes were sold to owners who could not afford the grueling annual varnishing and caulking regimens. The wood softened. The frames cracked. Thousands of hulls were quietly towed to the backlots of local boatyards, stripped of their heavy brass hardware, and either burned or left to rot into the marshland. But the brand did not entirely die. It was caught and held by a highly specialized, deeply committed American preservation community. Today, the surviving Elco yachts are considered absolute royalty within organizations like the Antique and Classic Boat Society. At the annual Wooden Boat Festivals in Mount Dora, Florida, on the deep, clear waters of Lake Tahoe, and along the docks of the Antique Boat Museum in Clayton, New York, a restored 1930s Elco cruisette commands total silence when it idles into a marina. The people who preserve these vessels in America today are not looking for a cheap weekend on the water. They are private collectors, specialized marine restorers, and maritime historians who willingly absorb punishing financial losses to keep a piece of the Bayonne legacy afloat. A proper restoration of a 30-foot Elco today can easily exceed $200,000 and require thousands of hours of highly skilled shipwright labor. They must source old-growth cedar. They must hand-buck copper rivets. They must apply 15 coats of marine varnish by hand. They do this because the original vessel still matters, and it matters for a highly specific, functional reason that modern production cannot replicate. A modern fiberglass boat, by its very chemical nature, is light, rigid, and hollow. When it encounters the steep, tightly packed wave chop of the Chesapeake Bay or the confused currents of the Hudson River, it tends to bounce, slap, and transmit every vibration into the deck. An original wooden Elco, heavily framed in oak and planked in thick cedar, does not bounce. It absorbs. The massive weight of the timber and the slight engineered flex of the wooden joints dampen the acoustic shock of the water. It plows through a heavy seaway with a quiet, heavy momentum and a dampened acoustic signature that simply does not exist in a world of molded plastics. It is a physical connection to the water that was sacrificed for the sake of convenience. If you travel to Bayonne, New Jersey today and stand on the edge of Newark Bay to find the physical birthplace of this American maritime empire, you will find nothing of the craftsmanship that once defined the shoreline. The 40-acre site of the Elco Naval Division was entirely consumed by the sprawling, concrete expanse of the modern maritime logistics industry. The timber sheds where 3,000 workers built a PT boat every 60 hours have been erased. The waterfront is now dominated by the towering steel cranes of container terminals, heavily paved asphalt lots, and industrial warehouses. There is no scent of fresh mahogany or marine glue in the air. The harbor has been completely optimized for global freight. Yet there is a profound, almost poetic surprise footnote to the American story of the Electric Launch Company. The name did not stay buried in the post-war industrial pivot. In the late 1980s and accelerating into the 21st century, the brand was resurrected by a group of American marine engineers. But they did not attempt to rebuild massive wooden motor yachts or recreate the gasoline-powered cruisette. Instead, they looked all the way back to the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The modern iteration of Elco, currently operating in New York, manufactures advanced electric marine propulsion systems. They build silent, high-efficiency electric outboard and inboard motors to replace the very internal combustion engines that once defined their 20th century dominance. After 100 years of noise, exhaust, and industrial warfare, the brand returned exactly to its original, foundational promise. Moving across the water in absolute silence, the trajectory of Elco reveals a brutal truth about how the United States absorbs, exhausts, and discards maritime excellence. The American market demanded a way to access the water safely, and Elco provided the standardization that made the middle-class boating weekend possible. But the market has absolutely no loyalty to the tools that built it. When a water culture built on local boatyard repair, traditional seamanship, and heavy timber is replaced by corporate consolidation, zero-maintenance plastics, and Cold War defense contracts, the vessels are simply left behind. The American consumer ultimately chose the convenience of the marina over the craftsmanship of the shipyard. But somewhere on a quiet stretch of the St. Lawrence River, an original 34-foot cruisette is still resting against a wooden pier, its heavy bronze cleats securing the mooring lines, its 90-year-old varnished mahogany glowing perfectly in the fading autumn light, still waiting for the morning tide and a captain willing to respect the weight of the water.